Well, welcome everyone. We're very excited to be with you today. I'm Tom Huntington. I'll be your host and moderator today on system sizing for IBM Power Systems servers. It's almost like a little tongue twister in itself. And we're going to talk about Performance Navigator today for capacity and performance analysis. This is a live webinar. We will be recording today's event, so you can play it back if you have to leave us early for some reason. We plan on about a full hour of activity. We're hoping for some Q&A from you, so line up those questions, send them through the question toolbar. We'll have 3 polling questions. We hope that you'll participate in those too, because it makes our life a whole lot more exciting when we have customer participation with those. And the handouts will be available too. So the recording will be out there, handouts, it's all good. And I'm joined by one of my colleagues and esteemed partners and a gentleman I've known for many years, Mr. Randy Watson. How are you today?
I am great. Looking forward to having this discussion today.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you with us. So Randy's been helping customers and partners for many years doing capacity and performance analysis. Myself, I've kind of always been on the outskirts of this topic, but great to have you with us today, Randy. We have a fairly, I'll say moderate long agenda, but we have an hour of content easily to keep you all busy. We're going to talk a little bit about the buzz in the IBMI community, the benefits of proper planning and capacity consolidation. The fact that troubleshooting can be one of the issues that you're dealing with when it comes to performance, and what do you do? We'll talk a little bit about competitive analysis. There are business partners with us, or you yourself may be saying, do I put this on Power or do I put this on Intel? And then of course, we're hearing more and more pressures around the topic of moving to the cloud. So those are our agenda items today. Let's talk a little bit about the buzz around the marketplace itself. If you don't know, Help Systems does put out a couple of artifacts around the Power platform. One, we do the IBMI Marketplace Survey. We've done that for 6 years. Matter of fact, last week we did a webinar on it, and we also posted the PDF or the report itself on our website. That's a free ungated download you can take advantage of. We've also this fall did the 4th annual AIX community survey. We grabbed those results here in the October-November timeframe. We'll be doing a webinar and releasing those results sometime around March or early April. We're working out those dates for you. And then we continue to do the state of the IBMI security study. What those studies show us is that, figuring out capacity and managing the system isn't always that easy, and yet many of you are faced, as we look at the studies from last year and this year, with upgrades. On the IBM I Marketplace study, we see about 61% of you are doing some form of upgrade, and specifically when it gets into hardware, that's where capacity planning is important to you. And then if we look over on the AIX side from last year's study, we talk about the reasons why maybe you haven't moved forward to the new Power 9 technology in that platform or that operating system, and some of the issues facing you there. So we want to thank you for joining us again. And as we look at technology hurdles, what are some of the things you see, Randy?
Yeah, so I think a lot of, when you're thinking about capacity planning in general, a lot of people think, well, it's a simple CPW or RPERF math, but actually there's a lot of moving parts to figure. Ultimately, the goal is to figure out the best price performance configuration from a hardware. And there's a lot of questions here. So these are just a few of them. Are you going to do an on-prem solution or a cloud or a hybrid solution? There's 2 versions of the enterprise processor pools for those people who are enterprise machines. You really have to be Power VM aware because we're talking about desired and virtual settings and virtual shared pools and a lot of these things that tune the machines. Obviously, are you going to go scale up or scale out depending on your size of your system? Of course, storage is a big deal, internal or external. And if you go external, how many options are there? Well, there's you could say dozens, but certainly there's several options for external storage, and there's many other options, live partition mobility or DR or HA. You got all those things. And as Tom mentioned, we're now monitoring GPUs if you're have any AI projects going on.
Yeah, so a lot to worry about there. And the other thing you should know is that Randy always talks about turn that flight recorder on or get that free host code running. And what we're using is standard things on your IBM I platform. We use the performance collection data. So if you're running that every 5 minutes or every 15 minutes, it's taking samples. That's the data we use for IBM I capacity and sizing, and we'll talk about why that is. And then in the AIX and Linux space, we're using NMON data. So we can take NMON data from on Power, or we can take NMON data actually from even Intel-based systems and use that for sizing capacity planning. Then the other thing is how much data do you want to keep around and how much data can you keep around? That's something we can help you out with too. We'll talk about how we can consolidate this information. So and then, there's benefits from using this actual data. So if we think about we're using the collection data, we see how your application is behaving over time, not just this week, but the last month, the month before that, and maybe the last 2 years. And we can use that to help predict what you need into the future as you plan your business growth on the server. So management reporting is part of this. Problem determination, we have customers that come to us and say, we're stuck. We don't know what's causing a problem here performance-wise. Can you help us out? We can answer that for you. And then, of course, a big part of what we do is capacity planning. What's that next system? Or I'm consolidating IBM I and AIX onto one frame. What does that look like? A lot of exercises like that that we help with. And don't worry, we can help you plan for those peaks and valleys as we look at this. So as I promised, we're going to do a few polling questions. This helps us better understand what's on your mind and what you're looking at. So I really appreciate if you could answer this first question. When do you plan to upgrade to Power 9? And maybe you're not. Maybe you're going to go right to Power 10. I don't know. Whenever that comes out, actually, I think that's somewhere in 2021, possibly, which is not that far off anymore. In the next month, in the next 6 months, by the end of 2019, in the next 12 plus months, we don't know if Power 9 is right for us. So um, we saw in this year's marketplace, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the number on it, but a good portion of the market already has gone to Power 9. So, and then I was very happy to see 7.3 as being on IBM I anyways, the most popular operating system level that people are at. So we'll have you take a moment here to answer that poll. Looks pretty good. I'm going to close it out already here on you. Looks like we have nearly 10% of you in the next month, 10% in the next 6 months, 10% by the end of the year, 36% next 12 months, and then another 36 that don't know whether or not Power 9 is right for you. All right, let's share those results. Hopefully I kind of talked to them rather quickly, but those are the results from our poll. And let's move on to our next part of our presentation and talk about the benefits of proper planning. So, there's many reasons for capacity planning. One of them is business is good. The economy is going great. We need more CPW or more RPERF if you're AIX to support this growth. Maybe you had some unexpected growth, unexpected because you put up this new application and unfortunately it didn't perform as expected. Or your organization went out and acquired or divested parts of the organization. So you have to plan for that unexpected growth or downsize that happen. The question of converting, especially in the IBM I space from internal disk to external disk, you'll see in our marketplace survey that well over 40% of the market now is using external disk. And do I use SSD? Or spinning disk, what am I doing there? Server consolidation, as we talked about, we've seen a lot of consolidation in the IBM I space. I think there's a lot of room yet for sure in the AIX space. And as we look at that AIX and Linux on Power and IBM I, we can mix these things together. What does that look like? And who has that view for you? Are you doing it all in a spreadsheet? Well, we'll show you there's a better way. So the other thing we can do is help you for that seasonal change, getting you ready for peak season. And of course, are you looking at the cloud? What do you need in the cloud? Do you just go to the cloud and use all the CPW, all the RPERF, all the processors that you need and not worry about pricing at all? Well, we're pretty much sure that that's not the case. So Performance Navigator, a product that's been built over the last, 3 decades, really, with Randy's experience and his team experience, for doing performance capacity, performance analysis for IBM I, AIX, and Linux. We've added, as we acquired Randy's group back in a year and a half ago now, hard to believe it's been that long. We've put this into our robot solution. Just really, it's still PerfNav. It hasn't changed any of the branding on that per se, but we do support it through our robot team, and we do development and marketing through that group. So it's a graphical PC tool. So the big thing to think about is that this is a really, it's a I'm going to say big GUI. I don't know if that's the right word for it, Randy, or not, but it has a lot of technology that's been written into the graphical interface. And then the collection piece runs independent of that. And we'll talk about that in a bit. We also can support other forms of Unix, Solaris, and HP. Certainly help people out with that. And we can look at Intel workload from Linux and say, what would that look like on Power? So at the end, we do performance analysis, performance management, capacity planning, and problem determinations. And this is a solution that's been used around the world. So Randy, what are these reports showing our customers?
Yeah, one of the things to remind people is that even though, as we were going to talk about in a second, the client is a Windows client, but obviously the output is all mostly HTML. At least that's what customers are using. So the first graph on your left there is like an enterprise performance overview. So this is a monthly view of the world, right? So in today's virtualized world, when you have capacity and or performance problems, oftentimes the solution might be, as I would say, robbing Peter to pay Paul. In other words, taking resource from one partition and giving it to another that needs it more. So having that view from not only, an all operating system. So you can see this is a one view of every frame and every LPAR in a given enterprise. And you can see some of the color coded, these are red, yellow, if you're below a guideline, approaching a guideline, or above a guideline, which certainly gives the admin people, okay, maybe I should go look at this and see what's going on. The graph on the right is a great example of what we do a before and after analysis. This is getting into a problem determination. This is technically an example of a customer who decided to go to the cloud. The graph on this is disk response time. The graph on the left is their on-prem performance. The graph on the right was their cloud performance. So it wasn't a CPU problem when they went to the cloud. It was a disk problem. And this customer actually went back on-prem because it didn't work. So they had to went to the cloud, figured out it didn't work, and they went back on-prem. So again, capacity planning is just not just cores and so forth. That there's CPU and memory issues that you have to worry about too.
Right. So Randy, you talk about free host codes. What's the story behind that?
Well, I think this is one of the subtle things that most people don't grasp the significance.
Okay.
As Peter Drucker once said, you can't manage anything you don't measure.
Okay.
And so we give this code away free, regardless if you're a customer or not, right? Because we want you to have this history. And this is the same for IBM I, AIX, Linux, it doesn't matter what operating system. And for example, let's say by default in AIX, we're going to keep a year's worth of data. Because when it does come time to do a capacity plan or a problem determination, that history is invaluable. I mean, oftentimes I can't tell you how many times people call us up and they got a problem. We look at it and they say, yeah, this job ran an hour longer than it used to. Well, we don't have the picture of what it used to. We just have the picture after picture. We don't have the before picture. So it's like it's invaluable. And it's real easy to install. Basically I'm going to say there's no overhead from a CPU standpoint and very little disk space. We sort of have some numbers there for you. So it's really painless to do this, and there's all the value in the world to at least collect this. So even if you're not a customer, when we do an analysis for you, it certainly gives more credibility to the analysis.
Awesome. So then, what makes the Windows client software so important in this process? And, we talked yesterday a little bit about why it's not in a browser, and maybe you can
Right.
explain that.
Yeah, as Tom mentioned, this product obviously has been developed over 30 years, and there's well over 100,000 lines of code in it. This browser, this Windows client does a lot of math. I mean, there is a lot of math that goes on because, for example, CPW is not in the data. You have to calculate those numbers. Our perf is not in the data. You have to calculate it. So there's a lot of functionality in the client itself. Not to be, but make sure everybody understands that the output, as you saw in that example, is all mostly HTML or JPEG generated. So the output is meant for the web access and so forth, but the analysis is in this Windows client just because it's able to generate, analyze thousands of LPARs, years of data. And again, when you create enterprise reports, again, a lot of people think about I want to look at my production system. Well, really, you don't buy LPARs, you buy a frame. And a frame could have multiple LPARs in it. So you have to worry about the hardware, the performance, how many cores, how many frames. Obviously, if you could have data centers, analysis, memory, disk, both space and performance. So there's a lot of levels that this Windows client is designed to help you analyze.
So what is the what if technology? What is that doing, Randy?
Yeah, so this is Tom. This is where all the magic happens. So there is this what if function, right? And over the years, as Joe would say, Joe is our the brains of the operation here.
Yeah.
So we take he used an expression this morning, as a matter of fact, we're taking we mix all this stuff up into applesauce, so to speak. So we take a Macintosh and this and that, and we take all these AIX and Linux and IBM I and multiple frames and multiple models, and we throw it all into this thing, and then we undo it to figure out based on any given different model. And of course, what we're really trying to do again is find the best price performance configuration, which ultimately is, okay, how many cores do I need? How do I configure those cores in terms of Power VM, desired and virtual? How do I balance workloads across multiple frames if I have those? Do I need virtual shared pools? How do I do internal disk, or is it spinning SSD? So again, there's a lot of moving parts, as we sort of talked about at the beginning here, and that what if function is what is going to give us the answer to those questions. And so it is a collaborative effort between the customer, us doing the analysis, and the business partner or IBM, whoever's going to order the machine. Because ultimately the goal is, here's the machine I want to go order, and this is how I configure it when I get the machine delivered.
Well, your example earlier showing the customer that was on-prem going to the cloud is just a classic reason why you need this.
Exactly. It doesn't matter whether you're on-prem or cloud, right?
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things. If it sounds too good, it probably is, and we should really look at making sure that we're comparing apples to apples kind of thing as we move into the cloud, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
As you do this activity, what are some of the variables that you plug into it? What do you look at?
Well, the first thing we do is then we bring all this stuff in, and obviously we want to figure out where you are today. So we have to understand, and we don't use CPW or RPerf to do this when we bring all this data in. We're basically using CPU milliseconds, because a millisecond is a millisecond, right? I mean, so obviously one machine may be faster than another machine, and we take that obviously into consideration, which is what a CPW and an RPerf benchmarks kind of do. But when we figure this stuff out as far as how to consolidate all this data, we're actually using milliseconds to do some of the math, right? And so that really helps us. That's how we do AIX and Linux, because it's all, a millisecond is a millisecond regardless of what operating system you are. And then we're going to do the math on that to figure out, based on a given machine, to try to figure out all the VMware Power VM settings, and to try to help you get the right number of cores. Because remember, hardware is one part of that price performance, but in a lot of cases, software is a bigger dollar amount than the hardware is. And a lot of software is based on how many cores you have and how much memory you have and how many, so understanding all that can actually help you reduce the software dollars, because that's often a big component.
Awesome. Okay. So now then we care about growth, and oops, I didn't get that slide forward here. So when we look at the solution, um, I am on
I
the
think
right
one
one
more.
here.
Yeah, one
Okay.
more, I
Oh, there
think.
we
Yeah,
go.
there we go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
apologize, Randy. Bigger fingers than we look at growth, and we should care about growth. And what do you do different in this regards when somebody's saying, "Hey, my business is growing. I got to grow my system," right?
Yeah, so just about every time when we do a capacity plan, most customers are going to say, I want a machine that lasts me 3, 4, 5 years, right? That's
Hmm.
normal and it's understandable. Uh, but of course, anybody who asks that question, the next question any analyst who would ask if they don't know otherwise, in other words, they don't have data, is, well, what's your growth rate? And somebody's going to say, well, it's 10% or 20%. So they sort of, I'm going to say, make a number up. Now, that number may not be made up. That number may be what their financial growth is. And by the way, there is a correlation, but it's never linear. But what we've done to make the decision easier, and we did this over doing this for 30 years, we turned that question around, as I like to say.
Hmm.
Given a configuration, so let's say it's a 914 and you got 4 cores active, what is my room for growth? So by default, we start out at 50%, which will put the peak point at 66% busy on a given configuration, right? So that's usually a
Hmm.
14% per year for 3 years, which is, a lot of people say somewhere between 10 to 20%, right? So, and what we do is show the customer this, and the executive said, well, given this configuration, which cost X, this is how much room for growth you have. And if that's not enough, if they're not comfortable with that room for growth, then it's really a financial decision. Then it's really easy. Start adding
Hmm.
cores, right? And every core obviously is going to add both hardware dollars potentially and software dollars. So that way, it's a financial decision. It's really not a performance decision. And so we kind of come up with this room for growth a long time ago because it's more an accurate way to calculate the performance on a given configuration, and then it's just a decision of management to say, well, how much room for growth do I want?
Okay. And what about when you say adjust workload by partition? What do you mean by that?
So oftentimes, you remember you mentioned some of the reasons for capacity planning, and one of them was, organic growth, obviously, or
Right.
acquisition. So
Oh,
we've
sure.
done a lot of times. So a bank A acquires bank B, and let's say they're both equal, and they're going to convert the application from bank B to bank A's application, and they're the same size. So in that simple example, we could say, okay, we're going to take bank A's workload and we're going to double it, right?
Okay.
So
Got
it's a
it.
percentage, so we can just do adjust, or we can take it away. Like you said, we're going to get rid of WebSphere. We're going to move WebSphere off of the I and put it to Windows, which can happen. Whether it should or not's a different question, but it can happen. So
Hmm.
we know what percentage of the workload was WebSphere, and we could subtract that to properly figure it out.
Got it. So it is sometimes downsizing too, and you're moving applications off. So
Correct.
what other variables do you see as important as you're doing these sizing activities?
Well, in today's virtualized world, obviously, you're really talking about server consolidation in most cases, even if it's a simple one or two, because most people have a prod and the test and the dev maybe. But today, more and more people obviously are going to external storage, right? And so that
Hmm.
means you're going to have a couple of BIOS servers, right? So you really are talking about, consolidating just your existing workload. Now, we still see a lot of customers that have the IBM people that and they have their machine, and the AIX people and they have their machine. But from an enterprise point of view, you really should look at this holistically, because they could be both those workloads can be running on the same frame, and it's
Sure.
probably more cost effective if you did it that way. So, and again, you mentioned Linux.
Hmm.
All the new applications, including AI and machine learning and all that, all these new things are Linux based. And a lot of those, I'm sure everybody on the call, there's probably some department there that are firing up Linux partitions left and right, right? Well, in our humble opinion, Linux runs better on Power. And what we want to do is show people that, and we can actually collect that data, as you mentioned, on x86 and model that workload on how that would look like on a Power. So that's server consolidation. And of course, we're talking about calculating the Power VM settings, which is critical. So not only how many cores do I need and what model and that kind of stuff, but how do I configure it and what's the
Right.
desired, virtuals, whether it's capped or uncapped, in the shared pool and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So as we talk about that, you deliver a blueprint to them, and what are some of those deliverables of how the thing should be configured?
Yeah, so after doing this for thousands and thousands of times, we do have a standard process we go through. Having said that, there are really no two capacity plannings alike, and that's Tom and I were chatting before the meeting. This is what's fun about our in some way, right? But we do create this thing called the State of the Union, which obviously, in order to figure out where you're going, you have to figure out where you've been or where you are, right? And this is a report, and these are mostly PDFs. I mean, technically, what's generated is HTML, but when we do the analysis, we're going to send you a PDF. But it's a State of the Union about a given petition. And then we're going to do one or more what if analysis. And even in simple cases, there could be, what if I got one core, two cores? What if I got internal disk, external disk, a hybrid, and so forth? So there is one or more what if graphs that are consolidated into a capacity planning report. And of course, we're going to do virtual recommend any memory issues. Disk there's many options, even in simple cases. Sometimes we do 3 or 4 options, and we can tell you what those options are. There's obviously several hours of detailed work that involved here, and we always come back and present this result to you. So there is a deliverable which we would then present to you and the management as we go through this, or the IBM or business partner if they're in the loop.
Yeah. So we're going to take a look at some of these examples of these deliverables: the enterprise hardware summary, the enterprise performance overview, the State of the Union that Randy just talked about, and then some of the what if analysis. So Randy, what do we have here?
So this is the first thing we look at when we're doing an analysis, is the enterprise hardware summary. I can't tell you how many times we produce this report, and this is like brand new news to the CIO, because this is a one-page view for the executives of the entire enterprise. It doesn't matter if you have 1 frame or 100 frames. So in this case, we analyzed 2 frames. There's 5 LPARs plus 1 file server, which there's 6 LPARs. And we tell you what, in the entire enterprise, how many CPW are installed and how many of it you have allocated. So obviously don't confuse with, having a installed capacity versus a licensed capacity, right? And we do the same math for our perf. We tell you how many cores were installed, how many of them are allocated, how many virtuals, how many vials, how much memory do you have. In the disk, like, again, we're looking at 6 partitions. There's 81 LUNs. There's 7.2 terabytes of storage. And I find this often interesting and particularly big. You see that out of the 7.2, there's only 32.7% of it used. My guess is the CIO probably has a requisition request on his desk for more storage. And obviously, from an enterprise, they're not using what they have now. The other thing that's really interesting is we tell you how many levels of the operating system. I think the biggest I've seen there was 17. 17 levels of operating system that's across the enterprise.
Holy
which
cow.
which is like, okay, we got to get our act together. And I've seen 14 systems there. So, and this is a hardware summary that helps us understand that, and helps us understand some of the Power VM settings, right? So you can interpret the graphs that we produce. So you have to understand, CPW, RPerf, cores, virtual, and you'll notice virtual shared pool IDs. That's important. Basically, for those who may not understand what that is a mechanism within Power VM to control software dollars. And you need to understand that, and whether it's shared or in the cap and so forth, memory, disk. So we know everything about how each of these partitions is configured that helps us understand how to interpret the performance data. And then we start at a high level, as I mentioned in that first graph. Here's another example of an enterprise performance overview. And again, it's like usually by month or a month to date. And this kind of shows you, okay, here's the average max. and peak and what the trend is. So this is like a one-page executive summary that you produce every month. And again, if you see some red or yellow, maybe it's time for the administration people to go take a look. And this is one of the examples of the State of the Union. In this case, what we did is oftentimes when we're doing an analysis, we scan all this historical data you send us. And to be conservative, and this is subjective, and it can't be a collaborative decision with the customer and business partner and so forth, but we find the day that used the most CPU milliseconds. So in this case, it happened to be September the 7th. And this is a 24-hour picture of that machine from midnight to midnight. And we're going to use that, as it says at the top there, as a baseline for our what if. So when we go into a what if, we're going to take that workload and then we're going to model that to something else, either to the existing machine or so forth. So that's one of the many, there's probably about 10 graphs in that State of the Union. But here's an example of just one picture of the what if. So this is our little machine plus a VIO server. So you can see by the two names there that this is both machines, and this is a 4-core machine. And so this is what the workload would look like on 4 cores, but obviously we don't need 4 cores because it's only 11% busy, right? So now we're getting into how many cores do I really need, which turns into how many licenses do I need, for software and so forth. And then we took the same thing and says, okay, what if we, remember that my room for growth, that default, I said 66% busy with 50% growth. So I said, tell me how many cores on a Power 9 924 I need for this partition to be the peak, to be at 66% busy, and the answer is 0.2 desired and 1 virtual. Now, if that's enough, maybe you can run that higher, maybe you can run it lower. So this is where the discussion comes in, and that's obviously a knob you can turn, which we'll show you a little later on in the demo.
Awesome, thank you, Randy. So let's, speaking of that, we're going to do a little live demo and take you into what size system do I need in order to consolidate systems, and Randy's going to show you some things here. So I'm going to make you presenter, Randy, and
you bet.
Take it away.
Okay.
You should have control now.
There we go.
There
so
you are.
Everybody's looking at my screen. This is the Windows interface. And as you can see over here, I am connected to close to 1,000 LPARs. And this is because we do capacity planning all the time. And it happens to be color coded. Blue is IBM, black is Linux, green is AIX. And the example I'm going to show you, just to kind of give you an example, is I've highlighted those 3 systems. So again, remember when we consolidate servers, we can throw anything into this what if analysis, right? So I've highlighted an IBM, a VIO server, and an AIX partition. So basically, we're going to show you, I'm going to come in and do what if new, and what's going to come in, it says, hey, are you sure you want to do this? And I'm going to say, yeah, I want to do this.
So Randy, I want to let people know too that if your screen is really small, there is a box you can click on and it'll make your screen bigger. Okay, for those watching.
Yeah, that's a great point there, Tom.
All right.
Now you can see it's bringing it in. Now, if I brought in 100 systems, this may take 5 or 10 minutes, but that's okay. So here we can say that I have brought in an IBM a VIO server, and an AIX server. It happens to be running on the same frame. It happened to be a Power 8. And I'm going to come over here and just kind of show you real quickly that how is it configured today, right? And those 3, and they all have to be, in this case, all running on the same frame. They could be on a different frame, it doesn't matter. But this is how they're configured today. This I's got 3.5 desired, 4 virtuals, 1 and 1, 1 and 1, and so forth, right? So basically, to answer, just kind of show you real quick what you do is you could come over here and say, I want to go to a Power 9. What machine do I want to go to? And by the way, I remember in the poll, like 30 of you said that you don't know if Power 9 is right for you. Well, by the way, capacity planning often, and I did one yesterday for a Power 7 customer, all they did is wanted to know how many cores they needed to activate. Or we do some models from a Power 7 to a Power 8. So it doesn't necessarily have to be to a Power 9, right? We can model anything. So then, like a Power 19, well, there's several versions, right? So yet you have to understand, well, there are limitations on some of these, but let's say we go here, and then you come back, and then you can say, okay, tell me based on this room for growth number. Remember I talked about 50%, right? And I'm going to come back over here and say, hey, just do the calculation. So it's off doing it. It says you can run the same workload in 1.38 cores. So again, how many cores do I need on this new machine? This is a 6-core machine. Well, I really only need, X or Y. So this is sort of how we figure out not only how many cores you need, but as you can see, what we do, the virtual is we have the virtual shared pool ID, because this customer already uses this. So this is how you control the IBM licensing. And then of course we go into the DASD situation, and this customer happened to be on a V7000 already, and they are already external. And of course we know how many LUNs they have and how big they are. And so are they going to stay on this? Or are they going to upgrade to a flash system like a 9100 or 9200, that kind of thing. So this is just many of the options that we can have in the capacity planning function that we provide you as back from an analysis standpoint.
Awesome.
So that was just a real quick taste of a lot of the options. But again, you can see a lot of systems here. Now, from a performance analysis, a lot of things happen underneath this Power Analytics. So this is more like what a customer would do. So management reporting. So this is how that enterprise hardware summary got produced. This is how you just highlight whatever systems you want there, and you click this. And these are all scripts that we've written that automate the process. And by the way, these can all be automated through the Windows Task Manager. So once you figure out which of these reports, and by the way, there's hundreds of them, that management really wants, you really then automate this to produce these HTML reports on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, for example.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Randy. I'm going to bring it back over to the presentation here, and let's see, I got to make sure I show the right screen here. Yeah, good. Okay, so as we answer that question, what size do I need in order to consolidate? Thank you for demoing that. Let's talk about our next item, is troubleshooting performance problems. And people don't realize behind the scenes how much we do help customers with this. So a customer is having unexplainable performance problem. What do you do to help them, Randy? What do you do?
Yeah. So, and by the way, this is when we do capacity planning, I want to say more than half the time when a customer sees the first pass at the capacity planning, they see a peak. At 10 o'clock in the morning, some CPU went to 100% busy for an hour. Inevitably, they're going to say, what caused it? Which gets into problem determination, right? So they want to know why my CPU is this busy, right? Because a lot of people think, and maybe they can control that, right? So in other words, if I can control when that CPU hits 100% busy, make it not do that, I don't need as much hardware, right? I can make the system last longer, or I can have less cores. So, but because we have the flight recorder running, and we use collection services and Inmount, all of that data is there. So not only does the client collect all this hardware data, but we track every job and every user, both historically, like on a month-to-date number for years, but we also track it at the interval level. So we're talking about the 5-minute or 15-minute interval for the last 3 months, so that we can actually answer that before and after question. Because a lot of times we get customers say, well, what is it? Well, we can actually just drill down and tell you what job it was with 2 clicks of a button.
Right.
Let's say it happened 2 months ago, because the data is there, right? Then we say, well, why did it do that, right? So a lot of times we get involved with a job used to run an hour, now it runs 2 hours. That's often the question. And the first question, the first thing I want to do is verify that, right? So I use the historical data to, in fact, verify that that's true. And by the way, sometimes it's not true. In other
Okay.
words,
It's something else.
it's something else, right? So there's something else going on. The customer's impression is that it ran longer, but the actual how long it was in the system was because we track runtime of every job historically, and we can tell you if it in fact doubled. And if it did double, okay, we verified that. Now let's go figure out why. And it's obviously CPU. Or is there any hardware reason? Because everybody's going to blame the hardware. That's typically what happens for that job to rerun in longer, right? And what we want to do is prove or disprove that theory. And by the way, historically, I will tell you about 70% of all performance problems are application related.
What?
Not hardware related. But 100% of the time, we as admin people have to prove that it's not the hardware, or it is the hardware, right?
Got it. But I think it comes down to the key is you got to have the flight recorder turned on, right?
If you don't have that data, you are hamstrung. All right. In other words, if you don't have it, you said, yep, it did run, but I can't tell you what's the difference between when it ran an hour and when it ran 2 hours. I just don't have the data.
Do you run into systems where people aren't running this?
Oh, sure. And unfortunately, we do a lot of capacity plannings with 30 days or less of data, which is sort of obviously risky. And we put all kind of disclaimers on it. Say, hey, for example, let's say if you are a retailer and your busy season, and by the way, for example, every retailer, if you ask them, thinks Black Friday is their busiest day.
Right.
It never is. I'm going to capitalize that with never. It is their busiest financial day. Right. It's not their busiest CPU day. Their busy day is in August and September when they're packing and shipping and doing all this stuff to get ready to sell all this stuff. Their machines get really busy when they're doing that, right? But if you only have data in March to get ready for the peak season, right? Mm-hmm. Your data in March doesn't look anything like the data in August. So then you start having to guess, right? Say, well, let's just be conservative and let's take March data and increase it by 50% to simulate August, right? So we can do that, but obviously it's much better to have that real data than it is just to guess at it.
Obviously. So we can, help people out with services around this. And so, Randy, let's kind of maybe show them what we're talking about here. I'm going to make you presenter again here.
Okay.
Hopefully. And then you can kind of show, how we go about finding out what ran too long.
Sure. I not just switch systems to my system just to make it easier. So again, there's a lot of options here, but I'm just going to drill down into like historically, right? And I will show you here in a second. And so, for example, right there on the 3rd, and you can see there was a little bump in interactive on the 3rd, right? And so now we're talking over a month ago. So I'm going to drill down, and now I'm going to drill down into the 24-hour view of the world. And lo and behold, there it was. It's something ran for about 30 minutes, took the machine to 100% busy. Well, I wonder why. And so if we use this, so oftentimes when we're doing a capacity planning, the question is, when we're using the baseline, is this an anomaly or is this reality, right? And in this case, this is probably an anomaly. But I'm going to drill down into it, and I'm going to get a list of every job that ran in that interval. And I'm going to tell you what the how many run seconds, CPU, milliseconds, job type. All I got to do is click on one of those, and we know what job it is. So there's Joe. Joe was doing something. There's our HTTP server. There was QEnter, right? So Joe was running some query, probably, who knows what he was doing. But it was 2 clicks of a button, I figured out who it was and why. Now, the question is this something that happens regularly? Well, by the way, we track Joe. We track every user historically. So we can know that is this something unusual or not. So this gets into, when you're doing problem determination, I call it a process of elimination. Is it the CPU? Yes, no. Is it the user? Yes, no. Does this user do this all the time? Yes, no. So you walk through a lot of options as to the profile of the resources consumed by every user and every job to help do that
Yeah.
problem determination.
Now, can you do that for AIX too? Can you drill into the process
Sure.
on a?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Now it's a
You
little
don't have to.
different.
You don't have to
Yeah.
show that, but
Yeah, we can. It's a little different, obviously. AI, in the IBM world, we're talking about jobs and
yep.
users and that kind of stuff. In AIX, it's called a process.
Right.
They don't metric it as
And
well as I does.
yeah.
I is the best metric system. I would say it's on par with Z
Mm,
as far as metrics and tracking applications. But AIX, does track the processes, and so we certainly do track that. So we can tell you what processes are consuming what. So, for example, in the AI world, when we see a CPU get
sure.
really busy, it's often Python. You drill
Ah,
down, and you're going to see Python as the busy process.
cool. Yeah, I mean that's true. When you think about AI, what do they want to do? They want to process as many images or whatever data as fast as possible. So having a tool like this to show the impact of, to your point, tweaking the application so it performs better is a huge deal for them.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So Randy, I know time-wise we probably got to move on to our next topic here. So
Sure.
let's keep rolling along here. And actually, what we have up next is a polling question for you guys. And let me open up our next poll. And we want to know what OS system you're concerned about. What are some of the flavors? You can choose more than one, I hope. You should be able to select all that matter. We'll see what our audience has. All right, looks like we're getting a little mix here of AIX, IBM Linux, even people with Windows out there. What can we do for Windows? That's interesting. Um, and so I mean, we kind of figured we'd have a pretty tainted crowd towards IBM. That's not tainted. That's a good thing, isn't it, Randy?
Yeah, I was going to say that's okay.
I shouldn't say it that way, but it's an okay thing. We're good with that. So let me close this poll and show you guys the results here. It looks like 92% of you have IBM, but then another 22% with AIX and almost 20% with Linux and 20% with Windows servers alongside of their IBM. That's pretty typical. So all right, thank you for answering that polling question. Let's move on to our next topic and talk about competitive situations. And some of you might not be thinking about, well, I'm in competition here, but Randy, what are some things that you've seen or done with customers or business partners that are looking at competitive situations? Why would Performance Navigator help them with these opportunities?
So as you mentioned, and this doesn't happen very often because as the marketplaces move, there's not that many Sun and HP servers around. But
Yeah, you used to do a lot more Unix comparisons, right?
right. But we do that because we can collect data on Sun and HP. But again, we don't see a lot of that. What we do see is obviously there's a lot of Linux, right?
Right.
And I'm going to say most of those Linux partitions are running on x86.
Mm,
And they run there for a variety of reasons. A lot of it has to do with in-house skills. They already have the infrastructure. The vendor that sold them the software, they can't spell Power. All they know is x86, right? So it,
hmm
it had to do with their background, their knowledge, and so forth. However, having done this for years and years, obviously Linux is going to run better on a Power machine, not only on a single LPAR, but you can stack a way more Linux partitions on a given frame than you can on an x86, even with Power VM. So by the way, even if you're running an x86 Linux partition under Power VM, we actually have a tool to go after the Power VM, the VMware infrastructure to understand how it's configured, right? So there's that place. Now, a lot of this stuff nowadays is talking about the AC922 and the newly announced IC922, which was announced yesterday. These are all
hmm
AI and ML servers. So it's the same question. It's with an added complexity. So now you have CPUs. You got one or two sockets. And then you have GPUs. I got one GPU, two GPUs, three GPUs. And this is all the question about when I'm using, and you mentioned Power AI Vision, which is a product IBM sells that
Right.
analyzes video and pictures, right? Well, how many CPUs do I need versus how many GPUs do I need?
Sure.
right? And these
Oh,
GPUs are not inexpensive. So getting back to that cost performance equation, we can profile your AI ML workload so that you can properly configure these machines, because ultimately you're going to put these in a test environment, and then when you roll this into production, you're going to cluster them. So you're
got it.
oftentimes going to have many of these things, and the question is, well, do I need uh, 10? Do I need 10 AC922s with 4 GPUs, or do I need 10 of them with just 2 GPUs because I never use more than 2? But we can help you answer
Right.
that question. So and again, it's all about the data, right? You got to
And
have the
that's
data
money.
to do this.
If done right, that's money back in your pocket, right? So,
Absolutely.
right. Okay. So the next topic is, I always tell everybody your CIO has two things on their mind: security. I'm concerned about security, and what can I put in the cloud, right? So you gave a good example of a bad example of somebody going to
Yeah.
the
Yep.
cloud. Yeah. Randy, what do I need to plan differently as I think about cloud?
Well, when you
Or do I need
talk
to?
to any, yeah, when you talk to any cloud vendor, and obviously IBM's pushing, there's a lot of business partners that have cloud, and they're good. By the way, today, Google has power in the cloud, Microsoft has power in the cloud, and then there's a lot of cloud vendors, MSPs, that obviously are an options for you, right? But ultimately, the question is the same. However, it is managed differently, because most of the time you are going to go from a uh, single tenant box, if it's an on-prem machine, to a multi-tenant box, which is the first question. So when you plan differently, one of the things you really have to ask that vendor is, you need to know exactly what machine they're planning on putting you on and what
Mm,
the disk configuration is.
yeah.
Because if you don't know, I'm going to call it a crapshoot.
You say
Because
IO matters in the cloud?
IO matters, as we saw in that one time, big time, right? And again,
Yeah.
if you think about when you go into the cloud and you're in a multi-tenant machine,
Mm,
every partition that's added to that machine makes the disk performance worse.
mm,
I want everybody to think about that for a second. So if I got
yeah.
10 L powers on a machine that's running off an external disk, and I put the 11th one on there, and that 11th one does the query from hell, all the other 10 are going to feel it.
Mm,
So you have to be really careful. In fact, it's almost more important in the cloud because of this multi-tenancy thing. So, but
yeah.
from our point of view, we can gather the data.
Yeah. So
You know,
collection services still runs in the cloud, right?
Absolutely, and so does
Inmon?
Inmon. All that still runs in the cloud, and it should. And if it doesn't, for some reason, you should require your cloud vendor to provide you that data.
Right. So what happens if I start to use more data or resources than expected? What should I be thinking about?
Well, see, that's the other thing about contractually in the cloud. So
Hmm.
we deal with a lot of MSPs. And even if you know you're running out of, one of the good things about the cloud is it's because you don't have to buy a whole machine, right? You can only buy what you need, right? And that is true. You can only buy what you need. But if you really need more, then you get into contract discussions. Can you contractually consume more than you've already paid for, right? And how does that work, and how is it calculated, right? And of course, we can help you plan for that, because if we understand your workload, even in the cloud, we can help you plan your budgeting. So let's say
Mm,
every month end, let's say you're in a cloud that charges you by the hour. So by the way, that's an example. IBM charges you by the hour, or
right.
can charge you by the hour, right? We can help you understand, so you can budget that every month end, I'm going to use 5 hours more than my standard, usage in the cloud. So we can help you budget that. So this
Yeah.
helps finance people, but the thing about you lose control, I think that's a very important thing to note. You can't easily change the configuration without potentially changing the contract or having a discussion, with the vendor, depending on which vendor it is and depending on how they're set up.
Yeah. So I think that that's a really, I thought it was important to talk about cloud because it has been such a big topic. We've been hearing a ton about it from all different angles. You need to think about what you're doing there when you go to the cloud. And So let me open up our last polling question. How can help systems help you? And certainly you can select all that apply. We do a lot with security. So number one thing on your CIO's mind is security. Let's help you out. Let's help you understand. We do the free security scans. We've been helping customers, walking them through what are your HA options. Maybe you want to improve your backup and recovery. You want to add automation to close the skill gap. We're finding more and more customers are struggling with, they don't have enough resources. Well, automation certainly is a thing that can help you out. And then increasing programmer productivity. You want to do more there. If you don't know, we work on RDI and can help you out there. So Randy, we did get a few questions, and while I leave that polling open, I want to get over here and see what kind of questions we have.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
trying to answer some of these as we go along. I don't know if I answered all
oh
of them,
yeah,
but
okay, you're multitasking.
I
But
am.
if if you only have IBM servers, does the GUI suppress information columns that are specific for AIX and Linux? So if you don't want to see AIX and Linux, what do you think to that one?
Oh, so you obviously when you go into the GUI itself, if you let's say you're in a big organization and they and all you care about is each individual user can connect to only the things that they're interested in. So if you're only interested in I, you only connect to the I. If
Okay,
you're connected with the whole enterprise, then you would connect everything. The AIX people may only connect to the AIX people,
yeah.
partitions, right?
So how does that flight recorder process work? Is it automatic? So it's automatically collecting the data when
Mhm.
with Performance Navigator, but how are you saying or keeping it consolidated so it doesn't take up all that disk space?
So on I, we have a data reduction process that runs every night. So basically, all of the host code on I wakes up 30 minutes after midnight, analyzes yesterday data, and it does reduce the data. So we use probably less than 1, maybe 2% of your disk after years of historical data. So this is how we manage the space. For Inmon, I'm going to say we keep a year's worth of a lot of data by
Yep.
default. Uh, Disk is the exception. By default, we only keep 90 days of disk data. Now that's a variable, right? And the reason is 60% of the space Inmon consumes has to do with disk.
Mm.
So we only keep by default 90 days of that disk to conserve space, right? And then of course we GZ it and that kind of thing. So we usually use less than 3 gig of space on even after a year or so on the AIX side.
Awesome. Yeah, so while we've been answering questions, just to remind people, help systems, cybersecurity, automation, business intelligence, document management, we can help you with all those things on IBM AIX, or even Linux if need be. And we help a lot of customers across cybersecurity and automation for sure in Unix, Linux, and Windows along with IBM. So keep that in mind as you look at solutions out there. A lot of crave in the industry about RPA, robotic process automation. We do that for customers. You know, we just, our latest acquisition, we added ClearSwift to us in the security space, and now we can do DLP. All right, so moving ahead here, another great question we have is, our application has historically been very sensitive to disk response. To meet our SLAs, we need to be within sub micros. Are there any things to look out for or warnings about external storage?
Yeah, I will tell you the biggest issue I see in configuring external disk is that obviously from a technology standpoint, if you go from internal to external, you should be at least on par. So in other words, if you have solid state disk internally, you better have a solid state disk and not an external disk, right? Now, the other issue is internally, it's a one-to-one, logical to physical. When you go to external, that's usually not the case, right? It's one to many. So
Mm.
a lot of people, the biggest mistake they make, because it's the storage people that usually configure this for the I people, and the
Oh,
storage
sure.
people think like Windows, and they think, oh, I need 4 TB, so I'm going to give you 1 TB runs. And trust me, I've seen it. And
Yeah.
that's not going to work on an I. So the number of logicals should be at least equal to or more on an external disk than you currently have in order to maintain some closeness or relativeness to, to the
Yep.
performance. So that's very important.
Okay.
The size of the LUN and how many.
And then question with storage again is I have a 924 and I'm using external storage, and I'm also doing storage replication with that setup. Does that
Mhm.
DR system, does that impact the production LPAR performance? Or can it?
Absolutely, sure. It's sort of transparent. In other words,
Mhm.
from the I or AI expertise, we know what the disk response time is, right? And it's X.
Yeah,
Let's say it's a half a milliseconds or 500 microseconds, right? So, but if you're doing a lot of DR and a lot of writing, to that, and therefore you're doing a lot of, there's overhead in that controller that's going to slow that guy down, right? In fact,
right.
I've seen where they've turned off replication and response time has improved. So it's
Oh,
hard that you may not be able to do that because that's why you bought the external disk, right? But it does impact it. But the thing about it is from a logical standpoint, we track that response time, and we can certainly tell you, what your current performance, situation is. And if it's not good enough, then we have to work with the storage uh, people in IBM or business partner to help. What's the possible remedies, right? Is it more arms? Is
sure.
it more cache and that kind of thing?
Awesome. Well, hey, Randy, you've done a great job on the Q&A. There's a couple other questions out there. I'm not quite sure how to ask the question of you, so we'll just kind of hold it off and we'll see if we can take that offline with the customer. Awesome job today. Really great hearing all about Performance Navigator and all the capabilities. For our business partners and customers out there, we thank you for joining us today on yet another webinar. We have more coming. Look for IBM i 7.4 and what's new in 7.4 in December, and just a variety of other topics coming up. We thank you again. Randy, make it a wonderful day out in Colorado. Hopefully you got sun out there. In Minnesota, it's not so good.
Well,
Take care.
we have the sun. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tom.